Gov and Law 1.1, The Origins of American Government. Or another way to think about it is a trip down memory lane back to U.S. History 9. Because who doesn't want to remember their freshman year? We have to go all the way back to Jamestown. Jamestown was settled in 1607 by the English government, who sent a group of farmers to establish a trading post called Jamestown in what's now Virginia. The Virginia Company of London was the first to establish a permanent English colony in the Americas. The King of England gave the backers of this colony a charter granting them full power and authority to make laws for the good and welfare of the entire settlement. The Jamestown colonists instituted what is called a representative assembly, setting a precedent in government that was to be observed in later colonial adventures. Well, we all remember that Jamestown was a dismal failure in the fact that the starving time occurred and most of the English settlers actually perished or disappeared. The settlers in Jamestown founded their colony based on the English Constitution. The English Constitution is a three-part constitution created over the series of about 500 years that establishes very distinct rules for government. It all started in 1215 with the establishment of the Magna Carta that established that government is limited and not all-powerful. This is a very obvious idea to us. However, in English medieval times, this was a very revolutionary idea. The English Constitution was further added to in 1628 and 1688 that established the clear limits and rights of the citizens versus the king versus Parliament, which is the legislative body of England. So the American colonial period, this representative assembly that Jamestown established and set a precedent for the colonies, has a very solid foundation in English government history. Seeking religious freedom, in 1620, a group of pilgrims settled at Plymouth in Massachusetts. They would then form a government, which was of course based off the English Parliament and the English monarchy, considering they were still technically governed by the English government, even though they were seeking separation from the Church of England. They created what's called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was based on this idea of John Locke. John Locke, seen here from the Lost TV show on ABC. If you haven't seen it, you should totally check it out. But John Locke was an English philosopher in the 1600s who wrote this book called The Two Treatises of Government. Basically, his idea was that the people and the government create a social contract or a verbal contract which can be changed when the needs of the people are no longer being met by the government. The Mayflower Compact and John Locke's ideas established a very solid foundation for written constitutions in America. A constitution is basically a written document outlining the rights of people, government, etc. There are several other examples: the General Fundamentals, which was a later part of Massachusetts government, and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which of course was a part of the Connecticut colony. Eventually, the American colonists established 13 very distinct colonies. Each colony had a legislature, that is, a lawmaking body. These representative assemblies were established as early as 1619 with the remnants of the Jamestown group founding that in Virginia. The representative assemblies divided power between a legislature, that's a lawmaking body, the governor, who of course reported directly to the King of England, and Parliament, which is the English lawmaking body. So therefore, America has a very strong tradition prior to the American Revolution of representative government. Between 1607 and 1776, significant changes happened in what would later become the United States of America. The American colonies established a very strong idea of independence, as their king was very distant across an ocean and often did not respond to their grievances, their needs, or their desires. The British furthermore placed all sorts of restrictions on the American colonists, everything from the Sugar Act to the Tea Tax to the Stamp Act, etc., which would finally lead the Americans to cooperate with one another, and as 13 independent colonies, they came together to write the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, you should remember, was written most famously by Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence, although it was very revolutionary, it didn't have any new ideas, but it was a summary of the consensus of a bunch of ideas that people should be allowed to make changes in their government when their government no longer suits their need. It was meant to be a declaration of the independence of all men, not just the Americans. It was meant to be a declaration of all British colonists. However, it was directly targeted, of course, to the Americans. The Americans claimed that the government did not protect the rights of the people, did not adapt to the responding needs of the people, and it did not secure the people from invaders. For example, we could easily reference the French and Indian War, in which the Americans were forced to fight the French and the Indians along with the British. Once independence was declared, that was somewhat of the easy part. The Americans had to come up with a list of wants and needs and must-haves for a new American government in 1776. Knowing that they were going to have to fight a war with the British to establish their independence, they also had to establish a government that would govern the 13 independent colonies. So take a minute to make a list of the wants and needs for a new American government in 1776 and see what you can come up with. In looking at your list, hopefully a few of these are on there. As far as the needs are some very specific laws, some leaders to enforce those laws, and some kind of court system to remedy when those laws have been broken. There also needs to be some kind of system to deal with money, whether that's a standard currency or some kind of taxation system, whatever that is, that's probably necessary. The wants, the things that are great to have, but not necessarily essential to a government, are providing some kind of economic stability, some kind of security, and some kind of rights. Yes, a lot of these could actually go over there, but these probably were first on the list of the American colonists when looking at forming a government for their new nation. The Founding Fathers, for our first national government, found the Articles of Confederation. The word confederation is what's really important here. The word confederation means that it's a voluntary association of independent states in which the member states agree to only limited restraints on their freedom of action. As a result, confederations seldom have an effective executive or national authority. But they create that because the new states were terrified of tyranny. Remember the principle of tyranny? The King of England made all these laws and rules that didn't respond to the needs or to the wants of the colonists. The colonists, remember, they won the war by uniting, but they feared a really big national government where one state would have more control than another state, or that the national government would be distant from the states that it represented. So the Articles of Confederation was created under this idea that the states were terrified of tyranny and they did not want a strong national government. That would, of course, affect the way that the Articles of Confederation would not only be written, but implemented and interpreted. The Articles of Confederation were a fairly weak governing body. Despite the accomplishments of the Articles of Confederation in creating a national government, there was many defects. Congress had the legal right to declare war, but they couldn't make treaties or enforce the respect of the treaties in states without their consent. In addition, it did not have the right to demand revenues or collect taxes from the states. It could only ask for them. So while it could collect taxes from the states, it had to get the cooperation of the states in order to do that. It couldn't force the states to pay, and there was, of course, an issue of money because each state would coin their own money, making it challenging to exchange goods from one state to another. Any amendments to the Articles required unanimous consent of the Congress and confirmation by every state legislature. So in order to amend or change the Articles of Confederation, you needed 13 states to agree. It had to be unanimous. Furthermore, the Articles did not create a national system of courts, which could not solve the problems between two states. So, for example, if Massachusetts and New Hampshire were fighting about trade issues, there was no one to solve the problem at a national level because there was no national court system. So basically, the functioning of the government under the Articles depended on the goodwill of the states. Article 3 of the Articles of Confederation established a league of friendship among the states. No national government was actually intended. But probably the most fundamental weakness of the Articles and the basic cause of their eventual replacement by the Constitution was the lack of power to raise funds for a militia. So you need money to have an army. We all know that and understand that armies are really, really expensive things. The Articles of Confederation contain no language giving Congress coercive power to raise revenues by levying taxes to provide adequate support for the military forces controlled by Congress. When states refused to send money to support the government, Congress resorted to selling off Western lands to speculators or issuing bonds that sold for less than their face value. Due to a lack of resources, the Continental Congress, that's the group of founding fathers, was forced to disband the army, even in the face of serious Spanish and British military threats, which would make the Americans vulnerable to attack by all countries. Because of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, the central government could do little to maintain peace and order in the new nation. The states bickered among themselves and increasingly taxed one another's goods. Overall, by 1786, so just 10 years after declaring independence, and really 5 years after actually gaining the independence from England, we were in a serious economic downturn for the entire nation. This serious economic downturn would lead, of course, to people being thrown in prison because they were debtors. So those people in debt who couldn't pay their fines were thrown in prison back in the 1700s. Daniel Shea was a Massachusetts farmer who was upset that debtors were being sent to prison, which would force them to lose their farms, their crops, their livelihood, and further add to this economic downturn. He felt that there must be a better solution. So Shea and a group of armed men disrupted the debt court in Springfield, Massachusetts, with an armed rebellion. What's important here is not necessarily what happened with Shea, but what Shea's rebellion actually said for the government. It said that the government couldn't protect its citizens, so angry mobs of people could take over the government and effectively shut it down, because there was no national militia, because the states wouldn't necessarily cooperate in giving funds. The government could also not adequately provide for the welfare of its citizens either, in the fact that they couldn't come up with a solution that would keep people economically productive, yet still paying off their debt. So changes were necessary, but what those changes ought to be were up for discussion. So in late 1786, concerned about the economic turmoil in the new nation, 5 states under the leadership of Virginia called for a meeting to be held in Maryland in September of 1786 to discuss the commercial problems or the economic problems. But what ended up actually happening is that they decided they needed to revise the entire Articles of Confederation. Among the important problems to be solved were the relationship between the states and the central government, considering the central government was significantly weak, and to establish other issues or solve those other issues. The Continental Congress would actually approve a convention in the spring of 1787 to consider the exigencies of the Union, which was purely meant to revise the Articles of Confederation. However, when the convention actually convened in May of 1787, only 12 states showed up. If you remember back to a few slides ago, in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, they needed 13 states. Well, when only 12 states showed up to the convention, they decided that they needed to do something different. 55 delegates would represent 12 different states across the entire new nation. They met to reconsider the relationship between the states and the national government, the powers of the national government, the need for an executive or some kind of leader, and they would meet to consider the economic stability of the country. What ended up happening is that they wrote what would become the United States Constitution.